Chicago has implemented stricter measures than the state. And in fact, actually today, May 29th is a sort of a target date because a lot of things are reopening in some capacity. So for example, I can finally go get my soon to be mullet of a head cut because hair salons are opening today. So I'm very happy about that. In terms of this ever-changing landscape though, I guess the sort of part and parcel of this question is how to stay on top of it. And what do you need to be doing as a company that is sort of returning to work or getting back into the sort of a greater return to work? Obviously, starting out with the federal, state, and even local government orders that are out there. As I said, Illinois has the governor issues, periodic executive orders that are updated every so often, and the city's issuing orders as well. And just staying on top of what is going on out there is a really good starting point. But it doesn't end there. There's also other really good government guidance out there that all businesses should be consulting and looking to when they're getting back into the workplace. A few of them, for example, are OSHA has guidance on safety standards, record keeping requirements, good faith efforts to comply with certain requirements. The CDC obviously has updated, is constantly updating sort of what symptoms are of COVID. And those are important because those also provide some guidance as to what an employer may or may not be able to ask about of its employees when they were coming back into the workforce. And a third one would be the EOC, which touches on various changes and updates in employment law and issues specific to COVID relating to discrimination, retaliation, et cetera. And then finally, the last piece I think is a really good starting point to look at is industry-specific guidance. You'll find all types of guidance out there in different industries. So for example, the National Restaurant Association just issued some updated guidance the other day. The National Association of Home Builders has guidance. And I know for a lot of you folks here who are in the industrial sector, BOMA International, for example, is one of the areas where you can get onto their website and look to various guidance and suggestions that they have in connection with reopening your workplaces. Jason, anything that you wanted to add?
No, I just wanted to echo sort of what you're saying and provide a little bit more detail and add to what you said. For example, the Illinois Manufacturing Association has their own guidance. Just to get a little bit more hyper local, the city of Chicago has published reopening guidelines for at least 8 different industries, including things like childcare and retail and food service. Illinois itself, the state, has published guidelines for reopening for at least 10 different industries. So just to sort of highlight what you're saying, it's very important to not only look at these sort of governmental and regulatory agencies, but look at them frequently because they are, this is evolving, like David said, and this guidance, this return to work guidance is updated on a, if not weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis.
Okay, so in light of COVID-19, what types of employment policies are you seeing out there that may need to be added or revised, deleted?
And this is Jason again. That's a great question, Steve, and something that is also evolving. I'd like to sort of start off by I'm not a big fan of just drafting policies to have policies, right? Policies are only as good as if you need them, and they're only as good as you're committed to follow and comply with them. The worst case scenario is to implement a policy and not follow it. It's sort of like Exhibit A to any lawsuit that's filed against you. But what I am seeing as a result of this pandemic is a wide sort of slew of policies that are not only needed, but that they need to be updated if you already have them. So let me go through some of the higher ones, the ones that I'm seeing more on a daily basis. Obviously, travel policies are being reviewed, updated, restricting what employees can go, where they can go, only essential business travel. But I'm even talking beyond just going internationally or going from city to city. I'm sometimes talking office to office, right? If you have an office in Chicago and you have an office in, Columbus, there might be significant restrictions on how you and when you, can send an employee from one office to the other. PTO policies, as well as unpaid time off policies are being looked at right now. Primarily because there's so many more leave laws out there, and there's flexibility that's being warranted and being pretty much obligated that employers need to follow to allow these employees to come back to work. Teleworking. Everybody was flipped on a switch. You got to work from home in many of these industries. So compartmentalize with that is, well, if you're sending your employees to work out remotely, what are they going to do with the property? Do you have a computer use property policy? Is there confidentiality and not NDA and really asset protection agreements that you have to look at? It's all important because all the company information is now outside the control in a lot of ways from the company. Reasonable accommodation policies. People are scared to come back to work, right? They're scared to come back to work because of what they hear. They're scared to come back to work because of what they're experiencing. So you have to look at this from a disability accommodation standpoint and also from a religious accommodation standpoint as you phase employees coming back into work. Infectious disease and response policies. As we phase back into work, what are you going to do when someone tests positive? What are you going to do when someone exhibits symptoms? You should have policies in place that deal with that, a response team and policies that address that situation. Expense reimbursement policy. We were thrust to work remotely almost overnight. Some states require that expenses incurred by employees be reimbursed. For example, in Illinois and California. So when they're using their own computer or using their own phone line or using their printer paper, does that need to be addressed and reimbursed? One major thing that needs to be looked at, putting aside everything else, is how are you going to allow or how are you going to inform employees to complain? Every single one of these employment laws that are out there have to do with protecting workers and giving them a vehicle to complain about safe work conditions or unsafe work conditions, et cetera. So just like you have a harassment policy that says if you're harassed, you complain to this person, you should have the same type of guidance for your employees as it relates to workplace conditions, so that there's not only a team, but an avenue that they can vet these issues and say, hey, I think we should be doing X, Y, and Z. That's really, really important. The only caveat I want to say by all these policies, and these are all policies that I've been asked over the last 6 weeks to look at, review, and update, is just beware and be careful about template forms out there. Beware about relying upon internet guidance, because as everyone here knows, 2 months ago, there was even no mention of wearing masks. Now it's standard course. Before, the symptoms of COVID were 3 or 4. Now the list is longer and longer. So as you're dealing with policy and procedures, make sure that you're sort of up to date and talking with your trusted advisors on that. David, do you have anything else on that?
Yeah, just a few quick comments. So one of the things that I'm recommending is that, much like I'm sure a lot of you that have handbooks, have your employees signed acknowledgments when they start working. If you're updating or revising or creating new policies in many cases, have your employees sign acknowledgments of receipt. I think that'll help. There's a lot of potential liabilities and issues out there, and just having them acknowledge they've received these and they understand what the protocols are in place, I think, is another sort of arrow in your quiver, so to speak, in terms of protecting yourself. And a few other, COVID specific issues, that you need to be considering is obviously the cleaning mandates and what you want your employees to do in terms of cleanliness and hygiene and, interactions with one another. Third-party access to work sites, both employees inviting people on site, but also how are you going to handle visitors coming onto your work site? Some issues there that you may want to, implement some policies and put them into the handbook and into, policy manuals at work. Those are just a couple other items I think that are important to look at. And then finally, I would say, once you put these policies in place, don't forget you may need to revisit and revise them as things change. This is a really unusual time, and it just stay on top of this guidance that we were talking about earlier, because something may change. The government may come out with new mandates, and you may need to have, there might be PPE requirements that weren't in place or that are loosened, or things that, that you just may need to tweak as you go forward.
So with all the differences and variations in return to work guidances and regulations, how do companies tackle the task of actually creating a return to work plan?
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I'll take this one to start. So I think the starting point obviously is start with the guidance that we were talking about. Make sure you're staying on top of what's out there by the government and OSHA and EOC, et cetera, and your industry guidance. That's your initial starting point. And then I think after that, start with the proposition. And I think Jason would probably agree with me. One of the key takeaways here, if you don't take away anything else, is that one size does not fit all for return to work plans. It's impossible. And there's so many different variables there that varies based on geography. So what's happening in Illinois is different than what's happening in California. What's happening downstate Illinois is different than what's happening in the city of Chicago. So it's really going to vary from geography to geography. It's going to vary from the type of work. Do you have a business that can rely on a lot of use of remote workforce? Or, in the industrial sector, most of it, that's often not the case. And so what policies might work for an office, a law firm, for example, is not going to work for manufacturing, not going to work for a restaurant. So the type of work that you do, the type of business you're in, and then things like the logistical issues, like the type of building that you're in, where I'm on the 41st floor in a high rise. There are a lot of different logistical issues for people coming to work in our place. Our workforce tends to be commuters. They take public transportation in large part. We have to take elevators to get up to our office. There are a lot of different issues that are come up with that type of building, as opposed to, something that's more remote where people drive to work and it's a first floor walk-up building. And then finally, I'd say demographics of workers are important. Do you have an older workforce that may have more, heightened concerns about exposure to COVID? Do you have a large workforce that has young families that are going to have ongoing childcare issues because of school shutdowns or daycare shutdowns? These are just things you gotta factor in when you're putting a plan together. You've really got to drill down on what the logistics are with respect to your particular business. So what may work for you just may not work for others. So based on all those variables, then put together the plan. And the plan is obviously you're going to look at the office layout. You're going to have to consider things like use of personal protective equipment. Consider issues such as work schedules. Can you stagger your workforce? Are you required to stagger your workforce? Can folks work remotely, as we talked about? Putting in cleaning mandates is really important, and posting information about that for your workers to make sure they understand. We also recommend, I think it's highly, it's a really good sort of best practice to put together a COVID-19 task force or points of contact. I actually say points of contact because you want a little redundancy. Because what happens if that point of contact, let's say it's your head of HR, becomes ill and is no longer available to handle issues. So I think you need to have redundancies there to handle COVID-related inquiries. And they may be employment-based or they may be logistical, just layout of the office. And then finally, I would say, once you put this plan together, make sure you follow it. It sounds, obviously it's like, okay, of course we're going to follow it, but it's the same thing with employment policies. It's great to have a policy, but if you're not consistently following it and consistently applying it, you're setting yourself up for some liability issues. And then I'd say finally, make sure you proactively communicate your policy to the folks that are working there. And that's not only having the employee acknowledgement forms, but it's also posting where you should be posting, making sure that employees are taking the appropriate protections. Jason, anything that you have to add?
Yeah, I'll just sort of supplement that. I think, you address this, but the importance of having, a team, a task force, not only to sort of develop these plans, these protocols, these policies that David is talking about, but to field questions as they arise when you phase employees back into the workforce, as well as, if you really think about it, to field questions that may come out by third parties, like, for example, if OSHA inspects. So I think that having that team, that task force from the very beginning is very important. And one final thing is, and you alluded to this, but communication is obviously very key, because there's this fear factor that people are going to have for some illegitimate reasons. But you almost can suggest a re-onboarding type of situation where you're training the employees on these plans. You're not only posting these policies, but you're communicating with them saying, here's not only what we're doing, but we're going to go through this to make sure you as an employee understand this. We want to make sure that you as a manager know what you have to do. So I would not, we're all busy. We all want to get back to work, but sort of take it one step further. And when they come back, make sure they understand what these policies, these procedures, and these changes are consistent with the return to work plan.
Yeah. So Jason,
Right, so David,
oh, sorry, one second, Steve. Yeah, Jason, we have a question, and I figured throw it out if you want to touch this, or I can address it. But it says these policies, such as cleaning mandates and third-party visitation, where do I find examples?
Oh, yeah. So that it's a great question, and I think just like I alluded to before, there's a lot of helpful guidance out there. Okay, so you always sort of start off with, what does the CDC say? What does OSHA say? But I will be honest with you, as this develops, I'm actually looking more granularly at what the state of Illinois does or what the Department of Labor is saying, because what you're finding is, and candidly, what industry groups, I mentioned, like, for example, the Illinois Manufacturing Association, they have this long piece of exactly, and it's consistent with the CDC regulations of here's what you need to do. Here's what our recommendation is when you reopen your particular manufacturing facility. Same thing with the National Restaurant Association. They have a very detailed step-by-step process of best practices. So start, looking at your industry groups, look at those particular resources, and then maybe work back from there.
Yeah, and then I'd say the one thing to add too is, like, there are, I mean, you can get on, everybody gets on the internet and you find samples of things. The one thing that I think we have to caution about is, and this gets back to this one size does not fit all. So even if you find samples and templates, you really got to drill down on what's going to work for your business and what the logistics are. Because that template may have been created in a different state, or maybe being created for a different type of business. And so I think, consulting with legal, consulting with your advisors, kind of work through the issues and things and put together policies that are going to work for your particular business, I think is of paramount importance.
okay, so you mentioned, David, liability. So that's a biggie. So what do you all see as the biggest potential areas of liability for businesses in connection with reopening?
Sure. Yeah, it's a unfortunately a loaded question. It's because as an employment and labor attorney, I see so much liability. So I'll try to keep my answer relatively brief, knowing we've got some short time frame here. But I see liability, and I'm already seeing liability from everything from sort of intentional torts for companies failing to take what I like to say adequate safety measures. Every day there's 50 more lawsuits about someone dying and their spouse bringing a claim for unsafe working conditions, to wage and hour related issues. Like, a big issue is we were thrust into working remotely overnight, again, like I've said before. So if you're a non-exempt employee, how do you track that time? Are they working overtime? Are they being honest about it? And so really, at the end of the day, I envision, I'm already seeing claims and or threats of claims of I'm not being compensated for overtime. Similarly, if you're an exempt employee, right, you're typically not entitled to overtime. Due to the economic circumstances and due to across the board salary cuts, there's a chance that if their salary threshold is lower than what's required to be exempt, they're no longer exempt, and therefore they're entitled to overtime. Sometimes their duties are going to change because, let's be honest, the reality of what people are doing right now is very different than it was 3 months ago. If their duties are now non-exempted duties, they're going to lose their exempt status. So I anticipate a lot of wage and hour related claims out there related to proper compensation. You're already seeing what I'd like to say is our retaliation claims. Every single statute, whether it's the Families First Coronavirus Response Act or OSHA, have all anti-retaliation provisions. So if you terminate an employee at any time during these last 2 or 3 months and they've exercised any kind of protected activity, such as calling out safety related issues or requesting sick leave, there are anti-retaliation protections. And we're already seeing that with some of our clients who have had to basically terminate employees for legitimate non-discriminatory reasons. Similarly, We have a lot of, and I've again already seen this because there's been a lot of furloughs and layoffs, are bias and discrimination cases. The question being asked, why did you select me for furlough or for termination? Why didn't you select this other person? So if companies don't take care to make legitimate decisions as to who they're furloughing, who they're laying off, who they might be rehiring or bringing back from furlough, that's going to lead to a whole host of discrimination lawsuits. Similarly, and I just dealt with this before this call, is failure to accommodate, right? So people are either legitimately or illegitimately saying, I can't come back to work. Sometimes it's, I can't come to work because I have an underlying condition and I can't take mass transit. My doctor says I shouldn't. Some of them are just scared to death to come back, but no real underlying reason. So where do we have the where would you have that obligation and that back and forth of what does the employer have to do? I'm already seeing claims in that regard. And finally, I just want to highlight this is we're anticipating a lot of union organizing. We see a huge spike in organizing activity in non-union settings. So remember, the National Labor Relations Act applies to union and non-union settings. And if employers are perceived to have been bringing back employees before adequate safety measures are taken, that's when unions can get a footing. That's when they can say, listen, we can help you out. And we anticipate that to be a huge push in now and in the coming months. So those are some of the bigger areas that I see some major liability for employers as they return employees to the workforce.
Yeah, just to add a couple other items, workers' comp obviously is going to be an issue. And I think that this is a state, it varies from state to state. So you got to look at your state's guidelines. But I think one of the issues that I kind of expect to see is a lot of challenges for employees trying to get around the limitations on workers' compensation claims. So for example, in Illinois, one of the exceptions to get outside of workers' comp is that an employer acted willfully or intentionally. And so I think, I kind of expect we're going to see issues where employees are saying you didn't take appropriate safety mechanisms in place and you acted willfully and you disregarded government orders, et cetera. And that's why I think it's all the more important to, as we've been talking about throughout, to follow the guidance, to stay on top of what's going on, to stay on top of what's going on in the industry as well, and to implement those types of measures. And then I think finally is an issue with third-party liability, but depending particularly on the type of business. We gave this presentation, a similar presentation a few weeks ago for a different audience. And one of the questions I had was from an owner of a health club or a tennis facility saying, hey, listen, when people come back to work or come back to start using my facility, am I going to get sued if somebody gets COVID? And obviously there's a risk of that if you're not taking appropriate measures. And I think one of the things that we're really suggesting, and I think you're going to start seeing it all over the place. I think you're going to start seeing it when you go to restaurants. I think, whenever you're going out, I think you're going to see everybody starting to use liability waivers. I mean, a lot of places used them before, like gyms, et cetera. But I think you're going to see updated and increased use of waivers, including specific waivers for COVID-related issues.
Okay, so there.
Sorry, one more thing, Steve. We had one other question. I could touch upon this, Jason, and then a few of it. It was questions. We're a small business, less than 40 people. Should I go to the SBA? And I'm assuming that the question is about seeking guidance. So my understanding, the SBA, I believe, in large part will direct you to like the CDC and some of the other guidance we're talking about. I'm not aware that the SBA has a significant amount of its own guidance out there, and maybe I'm wrong, or I just haven't looked at that recently. But I know that they do have a lot of links and things to, what the White House is publishing and what the CDC is issuing and things along those lines. So it certainly can't hurt as a source to look for additional information. Jason, do you have anything else to add?
No, I agree with you. My only comment would be, it wouldn't hurt you to look at a couple sources. Don't solely rely just on SBA if they do have actually guidance. Look to the CDC, look to OSHA, look to your industry guidance, because I think the more information you have, the better you can make an informed decision about what's best for your employees and the company.
Okay, so we've now discussed the landmines that are out there in the context of returning to work. So here's my segue question. Do you see technology as a way to mitigate some of the liability we just talked about?
Yeah, so I'm going to touch upon this briefly because I don't want to, take too much of Lewis's thunder, because Lewis will be talking about a lot of different technology, including some, kind of on this issue. But, obviously technology oftentimes means less human interaction. So it stands to reason if you can utilize technology to decrease the amount of human interaction you're having in the workplace, you're going to thereby decrease the risk of COVID exposure. And certainly, therefore, using technology can only really be a good thing from a risk management point of view. I don't know, Jason, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, I want to let Lewis have his opportunity to talk about that. But, I just agree, less sort of interaction or more ability to work remotely, will certainly manifestly reduce some of the liability I just talked about. So, yeah, maybe we should give Lewis the time. We should probably give a few takeaways here. Before
Sure.
we do if you could flip the slide to the next slide, that'd be great. So we'll be real quick here. We've talked about all these issues, but the reality is, again, one size doesn't fit all. I said it 15 times already. Can have all these different variations. I've worked on probably 8 to 10 return to work plans for different companies in different industries. Every single one is different. There's some similarities, but every single one is different. And in that regard, flexibility and patience is absolutely key. The consistency also is very important. What I want to sort of highlight is we've talked about this return to work plan. It's really important to commit that down in writing, right? And follow it. But also understand it can be a living and breathing document. It can be adjusted. So if you bring the employees back in 4 phases, 20% or 25% in 1 month, 25% another month, you're going to be learning what things work, how things are adapted, how things change. So understand that's a living and breathing document that can be adjusted, provided you're communicating those adjustments to the which is a really, really also key point. Remember what I said this before. You have this crux between, or this conflict between making sure people feel comfortable and returning to work and the operational needs of the company. Sometimes those are consistent, but the only way you can, and sometimes they're inconsistent, but the only way you can get the most out of it is to communicate why you're doing it and taking the best efforts. And that's your sort of best defense, not only getting employee productivity, but defending yourself if you get sued or if there's exposure out there.
Okay, well, great. Thank you, fellas. Now we're going to go in a completely different direction and talk about technology in the industrial domain. And I'm going to turn it over now to Lewis down in Miami.
Sure. Thank you, Steve. And thank you, everybody, for attending our presentation this afternoon. When we put together this presentation, our thought process was that for most of you all as attendees, you were probably experiencing massive COVID fatigue. And we tried to think, how can we put it together something that looks forward and then brings us into a different thought process in now that we're coming back to work, not just the policies and procedures, but what are some of the things that we can keep in mind related to our workplaces and also with the industrial sector as a whole, to give you some value on some of the things that we're seeing and the impact of the virus, but also just the impact of how people will continue to deal with technology issues. And I'm the chair of a study group in the firm related to real estate and technology issues. And I look at a lot of these issues conceptually, how they're going to affect the law and how real estate and our industry evolves based upon some of these technologies. And it really ends up being a very conceptual, question-based presentation and study, since a lot of this is evolving. Technologies are evolving. The laws on these issues are evolving. So it becomes more of a question of, let's understand the technologies. And from that understanding, we can all then formulate future thought processes and understandings of how these will be integrated. So specifically related to the virus and some of the things that Jason and David mentioned is public safety obviously is a very, very large concern. And smart city and IoT, which is Internet of Things technologies, fall right in that category because we're using technology in a way where we can be better connected, we can make better decisions, we can make faster decisions, and do that in a wide variety of ways. And specifically for the virus, you've got questions of security. You've got questions of personal health. You have mobility and connectivity concerns because by GPS tracing, we can try to figure out who's interacting with who if they have the virus, who's at risk. If someone is determined to have the virus, how can you trace that? How can you better clean buildings? How can you protect ourselves with things like UV lighting or other technologies? So there's really a conflux of a lot of different things to be able to help make us safer, and certain technologies that we're going to discuss today really have come to the forefront because of the virus. So the first, again, related to smart technology. At the moment, I'm not aware of a specific implementation of a lot of the technologies that could be out there, such as countries of South Korea or Singapore are doing with specific GPS tracing. At the moment, I believe the states are really just relying on low tech. They're hiring tracers to, if somebody tests positive, call them, find out who they've come in contact with, call those individuals. But the technology is certainly there. So if we go high tech and do a lot of the tracing, then you have very specific data and potentially a lot of data that could help combat the virus. And even if we stay low tech, all of that data is going to be accumulated somewhere. And that data is also going to be accessible in the future by any number of actors for good or bad intentions. So then the question is, when this comes up, for either you to be a part of a system like this or trying to understand what information is out there, obviously privacy is a very large concern. And that's what we have to weigh, specifically with smart city technology. How much technology are we going to allow or tolerate as people for our own good, but at the loss of the privacy of the individual? So that balancing act is going to take place as we combat the virus, and from the virus on, as we try to address other public concerns. Mary, if you could switch to the next slide. So specifically for buildings that you either own or operate, and this slide has a couple of different issues where from a smart building perspective, meaning that you have sensors or other technologies in the building to help track different issues in the building real time. You could also add to this individual security temperature monitoring related to your individuals. You could heat sensor trace individuals within a building to determine if they're for occupancy purposes, for social distancing purposes, and that could either set off an alarm to security for a violation. It could be traced just for data purposes, or you could have a GPS warning to people eventually for an app if there's a safety concern related to these issues. So that may be a little extreme for COVID, but maybe for the next issue, it's not. I find that when the question comes up for me on technology, I usually get asked, what technologies do you see being implemented first? And my response to that is, when the public safety becomes an issue, it usually pushes a lot of these technologies to be instituted on a quicker basis. So I would be looking first at what technologies make us safer, and then secondarily, what technologies are either need or nice to have, or potentially efficient, as long as it's not making people change their normal habits. But public safety is certainly a big concern, and I can't think of a larger public safety concern than the virus at the moment. So expect that a lot of these will be instituted, even if it's some of the simpler solutions. I know people are already talking about UV lighting. People are talking about upgraded filters on HVAC systems to help clean the air related to COVID issues. You may have some sort of automated cleaning and a way to trace how clean certain buildings are. Again, the technologies will be there. The technologies usually evolve faster than our ability to implement them. And then the question is what public safety benefit, what's the cost, and how easy is it to implement the solution? So I expect a lot of those to be in the discussion as we go forward, specifically related to the virus and smart city issues. Next slide, please. So the next major issue you're going to see addressed related to the virus is autonomous vehicles, or we call ACEs vehicles, as a larger category. So very briefly, I wanted to give a summary of when someone says ACEs vehicles, what exactly does that mean? And it covers these 4 categories. If you don't have access to slides, it's autonomous, connected, electric, and shared use vehicles. So all of these interact in ways to try to make things easier related to the technologies in vehicles and transportation. Specifically for the industrial sector, there's currently a trucker shortage, and you also have issues related to transportation and technology. So the virus and the current economic situation is ready built for an evolution related to ACEs vehicles. And what I think is very important when we talk about the technologies that are evolving related to autonomous vehicles is you really can open your brain and think of a lot of different applications and concepts for what's possible in this scenario. And I'll show you an example on this next slide. This is a vehicle that is being developed by Volvo to replace trucks. And it's a great example of what you can do when you take away a driver, because it's essentially a tug. And it's better modified to be able to transport trailers, and from the perspective of transportation, easier maintenance. This could be very easily be an electric vehicle. So there's a lot of things that evolve related to some of the transportation options that are out there. If you go to the next slide, just to bring this to a more recent issue. And again, what's fun about this particular area is it's evolving very, very fast. These articles actually were pulled recently related to how in Florida we're dealing with autonomous vehicles and delivery, and how we can implement those. So it's very, very fluid. It's a fluid situation. And what's also fun is you also get a chance to, again, I get to pull out all these pictures when I do presentations for different seminars. Other lawyers have case law updates and long recitations and memoranda, and I get to pull out all of these wonderful pictures and talk concepts. And I'm sure when people look at the seminar initially, they might think that, their kids got their homework messed up with all the other materials. But it's a good illustration of what's possible and how you can start to integrate these technologies in the current situation. Next slide, please. So throughout the country, and definitely in Florida, one of the technologies you're seeing related to logistics and deliveries on the industrial side is truck platooning. So on a connected basis, you have a driver in the front truck, and then you can, or you don't necessarily need a driver in the trucks behind. And by connectivity, the trucks are able to join together, get very, very close to save on gas, and the truck in the front will drive the trucks behind. Again, if we're talking about issues with the virus, if we're talking about trucker shortages, this is a way to transport more loads with less concerns because of how you're able to transport these trucks. In Florida, we're allowed up to 4. Actually, in the state of New York, you're allowed up to 10. So expect that truck platooning is also going to evolve and be something that you'll see in more jurisdictions, specifically for industrial and logistics, since hopefully this solution will help with keeping the trucking shipments ongoing and not having issues related to the virus or other economic issues. Next slide, please. So just briefly, for talking about autonomous vehicle legislation, a lot of states are already implementing or will be implementing the laws related to autonomous vehicles. And in Florida specifically, I can let you know that as of July 1st of last year, our legislature did pass a law that updated all of our motor vehicle statutes to allow for autonomous vehicle driving on our roads. I mean, in Florida, we have examples. It's a very flat state. It's a very long state, and we have thousands of miles of highway that could be good testing grounds for autonomous vehicle testing. So in the state of Florida, we're actually, I would say, near the forefront related to a lot of these technologies. But as the slide demonstrates, you may be in a state where you're also experiencing testing in the evolution of autonomous vehicles. Next slide, please. And truck platooning specifically, this is another example of where you see truck platooning. And again, because of the economics and the availability of the technology, I expect that to continue to grow. Next slide, please. Okay, another technology that you're seeing a lot of interest in, specifically for industrial and just-in-time logistics, is 3D printing. And I'm sure we all remember the headlines, and it's still an issue now related to PPP, is how are we going to be able to get equipment? How are we going to be able to get it to where it's needed the most and the fastest? And how do we deal with red tape and deliveries if we're relying on getting our masks from 3M, or if we're getting face shields from China, or those deliveries are to be shipped and they get diverted at the last moment? So with 3D printing, you solve a lot of those issues. And specifically related to the virus, I have two photos up here, but you're able to 3D print swabs to get those going very quickly, and also face shields. Face shields are probably on they're easier to create and transport, since it's not something that goes in the body. Anything that goes in the body is under higher FDA scrutiny. So the swabs may actually have a little bit more of an issue, at least from a regulatory side. But certainly the ability to print things very quickly and get them to where they're needed, or ventilator parts, for example, when ventilators were scarce. All of those things make 3D printers on the forefront. And then going forward, you may want to consider 3D printing, if you go to the next slide, in part of your projects, because a 3D printing farm eventually will be taking the place of larger manufacturing facilities and be able to do those just in time with only printing one. You don't necessarily have to set up and tool a machine to be able to print or to manufacture thousands of items. So from an inventory management perspective, from a creation standpoint, there's a lot more versatility. And you also potentially are going to have more industrial, what would, I guess, would be traditional industrial manufacturing done by 3D printers in a much smaller space, and potentially in a different zone space. Traditionally, when you're talking about in industrial manufacturing, it would have to be in an industrial use area, 1,500 feet from a school, with zoning and other issues related to an industrial location. You could set up a 3D printing facility, for example, in a shopping mall, and depending on what you're printing, if it's shoes or if it's clothes, you could have a retail in the front and 3D printing in the back, which again offers its own issues. If you have a zoning question and the zoning doesn't necessarily allow for 3D printing, or if the underlying city or municipality looks at that certificate of occupancy application and says, well, wait a minute, this is industrial, it shouldn't be here, even though it's a 3D printing use that could be there, you're going to have issues in zoning. So hopefully the law will take this into account. And because of the virus, people will look at 3D printing and decide that the time's now to revisit a lot of these issues for the good of all people. And if you have a retail center, for example, that's having trouble, you could dedicate a couple thousand square feet to industrial 3D printing, or have a large 3D printer and allow for different people to use that printer for various. So it may also help for space and give all of you a just-in-time alternative when it comes to product manufacture. Next slide, please. So the last issue where I also think you're going to see an evolution related to some real estate technologies that are out there, and the COVID virus is in the realm of blockchain. One of the other major problems that people had issues with when it came to PPP distribution is the red tape associated with getting the product to different areas. Or let's say if I'm the state of Illinois and I just had a shipment ordered of 1 million masks, and as they're sitting on the port waiting to get picked up, the federal government trumps my contract and takes those masks. That was a very real problem, but that's a logistical problem that that people had related to the equipment. And if those shipments had been done through blockchain, you're able to solve those problems based on the smart contract set up for the logistics. So in the contract between the parties, you could set up the blockchain to have all of the customs that the product would have to go through pre-cleared before the product is confirmed for shipment. And B, based upon the smart contract, you could set it up so that once that contract is secure, no other parties can get involved in the contract to reship that product. That product has already been accounted for in real time with any party down the logistical chain. And if you link that chain to different governments, the governments could all understand in real time what shipment is going where and to when, and if there's an issue related to that shipment, to try and deal with that ahead of time. So you can solve those problems as long as you pre-plan for those issues. And if we go to my last slide, having described the concept, I know a lot of times when I talk blockchain, people don't understand how that specifically works with the system. So in 2 minutes or less, and if you have issues with blockchain and would like to discuss how it works with me after, I'd be more than happy to give you the long version. But this is the Princess Bride short version. Is let's assume our contract related to a shipment of PPP. The system is going to is going to receive a request that party A is shipping PPP to party B. Every computer within that system now is keen to know that a contract has been initiated, and every one of the computers will then look at their blockchain, and one computer is assigned to take that stream of data, because the contract really is just a stream of data, and assign to it a unique code. And you can see in the lower right hand corner what those codes look like. And they're not intuitive, and they're not in seriatim. It's a completely unique code from nowhere. And only one computer within the entire system will be the one that makes that unique code. That code is then transported to every other computer in the system. Every other computer records that code and then understands that the contract has been executed, and now party A's items go to party B. And it's done in a secured real-time way, and it's done in a non-centralized way, so that to try to break into that code and falsify the actual process is near impossible. So, and again, that's in a nutshell how it works. And I know that I get this a lot, that people still don't understand it. I'd be more than happy to have the conversation later with you, but I at least wanted to highlight in brief how that works. So in summary, that's how I see COVID affecting these various technologies. And I think that these technologies will ultimately be a big benefit to our businesses related to our buildings and our logistics in more applications than just the virus going forward.
Thank you, Louis. We have a few minutes left, actually. If anyone has a question, please use your question and answer on your Zoom and send it in. We'll wait a minute or two, see if we have any questions.
Yeah, Steve, while we're waiting, I think one thing we forgot to mention that is our firm's website has some really good COVID updates and information. We have a COVID team in various disciplines that's constantly posting and updating information. So if you do have questions, I would encourage you to kind of take a look at that. Additionally, if anybody's interested, we also have a great return to work checklist that the Labor and Employment Group at the firm put together that really talks about a lot of these return to work issues that we were discussing earlier. So by all means, reach out to us and let us know. We'd be happy to get you the information.
Yeah, while we're waiting to see if we have any Q&As, we can do a little commercial for the firm in addition to the industrial sector issues concerning force majeure, real estate in general, construction, lending, forbearance. We have a whole team working on all of these aspects as it relates to the real estate industry in general, not just the industrial specifically. So do we have any questions at this point? Well, I don't think we do. I haven't heard anybody. So at this point, this will conclude our webinar for today. All attendees will receive an email following the program, which will include access to the webinar recording and also the presentation slides. So on behalf of the firm and Louis and Jason and David, I want to thank you all for attending. We hope it was interesting and informative for you all, and good luck out there. Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.